What if the greatest mistake we ever made about giants was assuming they were bodies? For centuries, we've searched for bones, measured doorways, and argued over photos. But what if giants were never meant to be physical at all? What if the real error happened before the search even began? At the moment we chose the wrong question. This episode is not about proving giants existed. It's about understanding why we may have misunderstood them from the very beginning. Every mystery begins with a question. But some mysteries persist not because the answer is hidden, but because the question itself is wrong. For decades, perhaps centuries, discussions about giants have followed the same rigid path. Did giants physically exist? How tall were they? Where are their bones? Who erased the evidence? These questions feel logical. They feel scientific. They feel responsible. And yet, this entire framework rests on a single, fragile assumption: that the word giant was always meant to describe a biological being. What if that assumption is false? What if everything that followed, the excavations, the photos, the debates, the ridicule, the belief, the disbelief, was built on a misunderstanding that occurred before the first shovel ever touched the ground? History is not only shaped by what is recorded. It is shaped by how later generations choose to interpret what was recorded. And sometimes, interpretation does far more damage than erasure. One of the most dangerous habits of modern thinking is retroactive literalism. We take ancient words, ancient symbols, ancient metaphors, and we force them through modern expectations of precision. But ancient cultures did not think in the same categories we do today. They did not separate metaphor from reality, symbol from structure, narrative from meaning. In ancient texts, a word could be simultaneously literal, symbolic, and functional, depending on who was reading it and why. The modern mind, however, demands clarity. Either something is physical, or it is imaginary. But ancient knowledge did not operate in binaries. It operated in layers. When an ancient text spoke of giants, it may not have been describing anatomy at all. It may have been describing scale. Before giant became an image in our minds, it was a comparison. Something was called a giant not because it had a body of immense size, but because it exceeded the normal limits of its context. A giant among men, a giant of wisdom, a giant of influence, a giant of construction, a giant of authority. Even today, we use the word this way instinctively. We call corporations giants. We call historical figures giants. We call ideas towering. No one looks for skeletons of economic giants. So why do we suddenly suspend this understanding when reading ancient texts? Because somewhere along the way, the metaphor hardened into flesh. At some point, particularly during the rise of literalist interpretations in the modern era, the concept of scale was misread as a description of biology. Oversized structures. Giants must have lived there. Massive doorways. Giants must have walked through them. Ancient stories of powerful beings. Giants must have ruled the world. But this reasoning assumes something crucial: that ancient builders designed environments exclusively around the human body. This assumption itself is deeply modern. Ancient architecture was rarely designed for comfort. It was designed for ritual, hierarchy, acoustics, procession, intimidation, symbolism. Size was a language, height was a message, and mass was a psychological tool. A towering structure did not need a towering inhabitant. It needed a towering idea. So why does the idea of non-physical giants feel unsatisfying to so many? Because modern culture is deeply conditioned to trust objects over meaning. Bones feel real. Symbols feel vague. Photographs feel convincing. Context feels inconvenient. A skeleton gives closure. A metaphor demands thought. And thought is uncomfortable. If giants were physical beings, the mystery could be solved. Find the bones. Prove the hoax. Close the case. But if giants were conceptual, then the mystery does not end, it deepens. Because now the question becomes, what kind of civilization thinks in scales so large that later generations mistake their metaphors for monsters? Once the physical assumption took hold, it began to reproduce errors. Every oversized object became suspicious. Every gap in history became evidence. Every unknown became intentional suppression. And skepticism turned into mockery. Not because the topic lacked depth, but because it was framed poorly. Critics attacked strawmen, fake photos, exaggerated claims, sensational theories. Believers doubled down. Hidden elites, erased timelines, forbidden knowledge. Both sides missed the same thing. The original meaning was never biological. It was civilizational. Ancient societies did not worship size for size's sake. They worshipped order. A giant could refer to a ruling class, a priesthood, a lineage, a system of knowledge, an administrative power too vast for individuals to oppose. In this sense, giants were not taller than humans. They were larger than individuals. They were structures people lived under, not creatures they stood beside. And when those structures collapsed, later generations tried to imagine what could have been powerful enough to rule entire ages. The answer they settled on was physical size. It was the simplest explanation. But simplicity is not accuracy. This reinterpretation is not about debunking belief. It is about recovering clarity. When we insist giants must be physical, we trap the discussion in endless loops. Fake versus real. Belief versus disbelief. Evidence versus denial. But when we release that assumption, entire new avenues open. Why did ancient societies think in such immense scales? What kind of organization produces architecture that overwhelms individuals? Why did later civilizations lose the language to describe that scale? And why do we keep trying to turn ideas into bones? These questions are far more dangerous to established narratives than any skeleton ever could be. The mystery of giants does not begin in the ground. It begins in language. It begins in translation. It begins in interpretation. And most importantly, it begins with us, with the assumptions we bring to the past, before we ever allow it to speak for itself. In the next part, we will explore how language itself, not lost civilizations, may be responsible for the entire giant controversy. Because sometimes history doesn't hide the truth. We simply stop knowing how to read it. Modern audiences often assume that language is a passive tool, that words simply label things that already exist. But historically, language has never functioned this way. Language creates scale. Language assigns importance. Language compresses complex systems into single terms. When ancient societies spoke of giants, they were not documenting anatomy. They were encoding relationships between humans and power, between individuals and systems, between the visible and the overwhelming. The error occurred when later readers assumed that every noun must correspond to a physical object. That assumption is modern, and it is deeply misleading. Ancient texts were not written to satisfy future historians. They were written to preserve order, transmit authority, reinforce worldview, teach obedience, explain the unmanageable. Words functioned as containers, not definitions. When an ancient culture used a term equivalent to giant, It often meant something beyond individual resistance, something that structured daily life, something that could not be confronted directly. In other words, a system, not a body. In ancient storytelling, metaphor was not decorative. It was operational. A mountain could be a god. A storm could be a ruler's anger. A giant could be a dynasty. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was a method of compressing complexity into memory. Large-scale concepts needed large-scale imagery, and size was the most intuitive metaphor available. Not height in meters, but height in influence. The true disaster did not occur when ancient civilizations fell. It occurred when context collapsed. As languages evolved, metaphors fossilized. Later readers inherited words without inheriting. The worldview, the symbolic literacy, the societal structure that gave those words meaning. Without context, metaphor becomes absurd. A story meant to describe hierarchy becomes a story about monsters. A narrative about power becomes a narrative about bodies. This is not deception. It is misreading. Every translation is an interpretation. And when ancient terms were translated into modern languages, they were often stripped of their layered meanings. A word that once meant vast, dominant, overwhelming, unchallengeable, became tall, large, physically oversized. This shift seems small, but its consequences were enormous. Because once a metaphor is translated into anatomy, it demands evidence. And when evidence is not found, belief fractures. Ancient societies were not obsessed with proving giants existed. They accepted them as narrative devices. The obsession with proof is modern. It arises from scientific materialism, institutional authority, fear of ambiguity. Once science became the dominant lens, everything had to become measurable. And giants, once symbolic, were dragged into laboratories and excavation sites. But science cannot test metaphor. So the topic collapsed into ridicule on one side and conspiracy on the other. Both outcomes stem from the same mistake, treating language as literal when it was never intended to be. Consider how ancient societies referred to empires, priesthoods, divine kingship, cosmic order. They did not use abstract political language. They used bodies, because bodies are relatable. Bodies carry fear. Bodies command attention. A giant was a way to say, "This is bigger than you. This is not meant to be challenged. This stands above individuals." In that sense, giants were not myths. They were warnings. The modern reader wants numbers. How tall? How heavy? How old? But ancient narratives were not concerned with metrics. They were concerned with meaning. Asking ancient texts for measurements is like asking a painting for coordinates. The question misunderstands the medium. Giants were never meant to be measured. They were meant to be felt. Once giants were assumed to be physical, images began to appear. Illustrations, recreations, later, photographs. These images did not create belief. They responded to it. The audience demanded bodies. So bodies were supplied, not as evidence, but as visual answers to a misframed question. And once images exist, they gain authority, even when they are symbolic, even when they are fabricated, even when they are misunderstood. What remains today is not evidence of giants, but evidence of linguistic fossils, words that outlived the systems they described, stories that survived the civilizations that created them. When later societies encountered these remnants, they filled the gaps with physical assumptions, because physical explanations feel safer. than admitting we no longer understand the language of the past. If giants were never biological, then many debates collapse, not because they are false, but because they were misdirected. This threatens sensational narratives, simplistic debunking, binary thinking. It forces a harder task, learning how ancient minds organized reality, and that requires humility. The question is no longer, did giants exist? The real question becomes, what kind of civilization needed giants as a concept? What kind of world produces systems so vast, so dominant, so unquestionable, that the only way to describe them is to turn them into towering beings? That is the question we will pursue next. Because once language outgrows the body, history stops being about creatures and starts being about structures. Long before stone was stacked into monumental forms, long before architecture spoke the language of power, there was something far more overwhelming than any building: organized knowledge. Not knowledge as isolated facts, but knowledge as a coordinated system, distributed across people, generations, and functions. To ancient individuals, such systems were invisible, untouchable, and utterly beyond personal control. They were not just powerful. They were giant. Modern education trains individuals to accumulate knowledge personally. Ancient civilizations did not function this way. Knowledge was fragmented intentionally. No single person held the entire system. Instead, priests held calendars, engineers held measurements, administrators held logistics, astronomers held cycles, scribes held records. Each role knew only a portion. The whole existed only at the level of the system. From the perspective of an ordinary person, this system was incomprehensible. It moved societies. It organized labor. It aligned structures with stars. It coordinated thousands of people without visible leadership. To the individual, it appeared autonomous, alive. When outcomes exceed individual understanding, humans attribute agency. If crops align with celestial cycles, someone or something must be controlling it. If structures rise with precision beyond visible tools, someone or something must know more than humans. But the truth is more unsettling. No single human did. The system did. And systems, when large enough, feel indistinguishable from beings. They act. They persist. They punish deviation. They reward obedience. They outlive individuals. In every meaningful sense, they behave like giants. Ancient societies did not treat knowledge as neutral information. They treated it as a force. Knowledge was guarded, ritualized, restricted, inherited, encoded. Access to it defined hierarchy. You did not learn sacred knowledge casually. You were initiated. And initiation did not mean understanding everything. It meant being allowed to participate. This is why ancient texts often describe knowledge as forbidden, dangerous, heavy, overwhelming. These are not metaphors of data. They are metaphors of power. Unlike biological giants, knowledge required no physical form. It could inhabit temples, symbols, calendars, oral traditions, architecture itself. It did not walk. It did not speak directly. And yet it governed. Entire populations aligned their lives to knowledge they could not verify. When to plant, when to build, when to move, when to worship. From the outside, such coordination appears impossible without a ruling being. From the inside, it feels inevitable. When later civilizations encountered remnants of ancient systems, structures, symbols, alignments. They faced a problem. The knowledge that animated these systems was gone, but the effects remained. Without access to the logic, later cultures filled the gap with narrative. What they could not explain structurally, they explained biologically. The system became a being. The function became a creature. The process became a giant. This was not ignorance. It was an attempt to preserve meaning. The stories of giants often describe beings who shaped landscapes, commanded forces, lived long lives, vanished suddenly. These traits align poorly with biology, but they align perfectly with systems. Systems shape landscapes. Systems command resources. Systems outlive generations. Systems collapse abruptly. When a system falls, its absence feels catastrophic. To those who depended on it, its disappearance feels like death, and death invites myth. When centralized knowledge systems collapse, they do not vanish evenly. They fragment. Pieces survive in rituals without explanation, structures without blueprints, calendars without context, symbols without meaning. Later societies inherit fragments and try to reconstruct the whole. But reconstruction without framework leads to distortion. This is where giants return, as attempts to unify fragments into a single explanation. This is why the debate over physical giants never resolves. Because the original phenomenon was never physical. You cannot excavate a system. You cannot carbon date coordination. You cannot photograph distributed intelligence. What remains are artifacts, and artifacts without systems always mislead. Searching for bones to prove giants existed is like searching for a skeleton of an economy. The error is categorical. What made ancient knowledge giant was not its content, but its asymmetry. Some knew when the stars aligned. Most did not. Some knew how stones fit. Most did not. Some knew the cycles. Most obeyed them. This imbalance created obedience, without visible force. That is the purest form of power. As systems grew more complex, no human could oversee them entirely. The system governed itself. Feedback loops replaced command. Tradition replaced instruction. Ritual replaced reasoning. At this point, knowledge ceased to feel human. It became other. And humans, encountering forces they cannot control, give them form. That form was the giant. Modern culture insists that humans are the highest agents. But the idea that ancient societies were ruled by systems, not kings, not gods, not giants, challenges that comfort. It suggests humans create forces that exceed them. Coordination can dominate individuals. Intelligence does not require a face. These ideas are more unsettling than tall skeletons. Giants were never beings that ruled humans. They were systems humans built, and then lost control over. Architecture was their body. Ritual was their movement. Knowledge was their mind. When the system collapsed, humans remembered the giant, but not how it worked. If knowledge was the first giant, then the next question becomes critical. Who maintained it? Who ensured continuity across generations? Who acted as the interface between system and society? In the next part, we will examine the role of keepers, priests, and intermediaries, not as rulers, but as translators between humans and giants. Because giants do not speak directly, they always speak through others. In every culture where giants appear, there is a strange consistency. Giants rarely speak directly to ordinary people. Instead, they communicate through intermediaries, messengers, priests, scribes, guardians. or chosen lineages. This pattern is not accidental. If giants were systems, vast, abstract, impersonal, then direct communication would be impossible. Systems do not speak. They require translators. Ancient societies did not place knowledge in the hands of everyone. They placed it in the hands of keepers. A keeper was not a ruler in the modern sense, nor were they merely scholars. They were interfaces, interpreters, stabilizers. Their role was not to create the system, but to maintain alignment between society and the system. They did not command giants. They listened to them. To ordinary people, keepers appeared contradictory. They lived among humans, but operated according to rules others could not see. They enforced rituals whose logic was unclear. They announced timings whose reasoning was invisible. They warned of consequences no one could verify. From the outside, this looks like superstition. From the inside, it is system maintenance. When a system is too large to explain to individuals, it must be embodied in people. That embodiment creates authority, and authority, when opaque, breeds fear. Many ancient texts describe keepers as receiving instructions from gods, giants, or higher beings. This is often interpreted literally. But consider another possibility. The keeper was not receiving commands from an entity. They were reading patterns, astronomical cycles, seasonal feedback, structural stress, population thresholds. To the uninitiated, pattern recognition looks like prophecy. To the keeper, it is observation. To describe this process, ancient language used the only framework available: communication with beings beyond human scale. Knowledge maintenance requires consistency. Consistency across generations cannot rely on memory alone. So ancient societies encoded knowledge into rituals, chants, processions, prohibitions. Ritual removes the need for understanding. It preserves function without explanation. The keeper's job was not to explain why, but to ensure the ritual continued unchanged. In this sense, ritual was the operating system, and the keeper was the administrator. Keepers existed at a boundary, between knowledge and ignorance, between system and society, between past and future. They limited access not out of cruelty, but necessity. If everyone understood the system partially, it would degrade. If too many people altered it, it would collapse. Restriction was not oppression. It was preservation. Over time, the distinction blurred. People no longer saw the system. They saw only the keeper. The keeper became the voice of the giant, the hand of the giant, sometimes even the face of the giant. Stories shifted. What was once "the giant demands this ritual" became "the keeper commands it," and later, "the keeper is the giant." This is how metaphors crystallize into beings. Keepers were powerful, but precarious. Their authority depended entirely on continuity, trust, alignment with the system. If a ritual failed, if a prediction missed, if a structure collapsed, the keeper's legitimacy shattered. Unlike kings, they could not rely on force. Unlike warriors, they could not rely on strength. Their power existed only as long as the system worked. When systems began to fail, due to climate shifts, population pressure, resource exhaustion, keepers faced an impossible situation. They could not explain the failure without exposing the system's limits. So narratives intensified. Giants became angrier. Gods became distant. Rituals became stricter. From the outside, this looks like manipulation. From the inside, it is desperation. Eventually, the system degraded beyond repair. Patterns no longer aligned. Rituals lost effectiveness. Predictions failed repeatedly. At this moment, the keeper ceased to be a translator and became a target. People did not blame the system. They blamed the voice. This is when keepers disappear from history. Not gradually, but abruptly. After collapse, later societies inherit fragments of ritual, fragments of structure, fragments of story. But the keeper class is gone. Why? Because they were system-dependent. Once the system died, their role ceased to exist. They left no monuments to themselves. They left no dynasties, only warnings. After the keepers vanished, giants became silent. No one could interpret them anymore. Architecture remained, but unreadable. Calendars existed, but unused. Symbols persisted, but meaningless. Later cultures encountered these remains and attempted interpretation. Without keepers, giants became monsters. What once functioned as operational knowledge became story. Story became legend. Legend became myth. And myth, when misunderstood, becomes literal belief. Giants walking the earth. Giants lifting stones. Giants ruling humans. These are not lies. They are memories without instructions. Keepers paid a price. They carried responsibility without recognition. They bore blame without protection. They existed between forces no one else could see. When systems worked, they were invisible. When systems failed, they were expendable. This pattern repeats across history. Modern society still relies on keepers. Engineers maintaining infrastructure. Scientists interpreting data. Economists managing systems too complex for individuals. When systems fail, we blame the interface, not the structure. The giant remains unseen. If giants were systems, and keepers were translators, then the final question remains. Why did later societies choose to misunderstand all of this? Why was the system forgotten, but the myth preserved? Why were giants turned into bodies, instead of remembered as structures? In the final part, we will examine how myth was simplified deliberately, not erased, but reshaped, because forgetting is not always accidental. Sometimes it is functional. To understand a system requires patience, humility, and discipline. To believe in a being requires only imagination. When ancient societies inherited the remains of giant systems, without the keepers, without the instructions, without the context, they faced a choice. They could attempt to reconstruct understanding, or they could replace it with belief. Belief was easier. A system implies responsibility. If the giant was a system, then humans were participants. Failures were shared. Consequences were collective. But if the giant was a being, then responsibility could be externalized. The giant decided. The giant failed. The giant punished. This shift was not ignorance. It was psychological relief. Abstract ideas decay quickly. Stories survive only when they are embodied. A giant with arms, legs, hunger, anger is easier to remember than a calendar alignment, a resource threshold, a structural feedback loop. By giving giants bodies, memory became portable. Accuracy was sacrificed for survival. Post-collapse societies were smaller, less centralized, more fragile. They did not need systems that spanned centuries. They needed moral lessons, warnings, boundaries. So giants were reshaped, not as systems to operate, but as forces to fear. The myth was compressed. to fit a simpler world. A mechanism asks, "How does this work?" A monster asks, "What must I avoid?" For societies rebuilding from ruin, avoidance was safer than operation. Thus giants became enemies, chaos bringers, relics of a dangerous past, not because they were evil, but because they were no longer manageable. A system operates at a scale larger than a human lifetime, but stories are told within lifetimes. As generations passed, scale collapsed. What once took centuries was retold as a single act. What once required coordination was attributed to strength. This is how engineering becomes lifting, planning becomes domination, structure becomes body. Modern debates often mock ancient literal belief, but literalism is not stupidity. It is what happens when abstraction outlives explanation. Without a framework, the mind defaults to the concrete. Giants walking the earth are not foolish ideas. They are collapsed explanations. Once giants became bodies, recovery became impossible, because searching for a body prevents searching for a system. Archaeology looks for bones. Mythology looks for bloodlines. Speculation looks for hybrids. None of them look for operating principles. The question was misasked from the start. The ancient world did not forget giants. It forgot how to use them. The systems worked until humans outgrew the ability to maintain them. The myth survived because it required nothing in return. Giants did not vanish. They changed form. They exist now as financial systems, technological infrastructures, ecological balances, global supply chains. They are invisible, immense, and unforgiving. And once again, most people interact only with their interfaces. Today, keepers exist again, not as priests, but as analysts, engineers, planners, scientists. They speak in data, not ritual, yet the pattern is the same. When systems fail, we blame the translators. We face the same decision as post-giant societies once did. Do we simplify systems into villains, or learn to understand scale again? Do we turn complexity into monsters, or responsibility into participation? Giants were never meant to be admired. They were reminders of scale beyond instinct, of power beyond individuals, of consequences delayed but absolute. They warned ancient societies what happens when understanding ends, but operation continues. The true danger was never giants. It was forgetting that something larger than us requires understanding, not worship. If giants once ruled the earth, it was not by walking upon it. They ruled by structure, by time, by alignment. And when humans stopped listening, not to the giant, but to the system, the story had to change, because a forgotten system can only survive as a myth.